Good evening and welcome. If you are listening quietly in the background tonight, let this be a calm companion for the room, something steady and unhurried while the day grows softer around you. For the next while, we will move slowly through the lives of Roman emperors, looking not only at the famous names, but at the habits, rituals, pressures, symbols, and small human details that shaped imperial Rome. If you enjoy these gentle historical journeys, you are always welcome to like the video, subscribe, or leave a quiet comment if you feel like it, perhaps with where you are listening from tonight, or what part of history you might like to rest with next. But there is no hurry at all. Tonight is meant to be easy. Settle back where you are most comfortable. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the light in the room feel a little dimmer, a little warmer. Imagine distant marble halls, bronze coins passing from hand to hand, the muted echo of sandals on stone, and the long, patient rhythm of empire unfolding across centuries. And now, without rushing, we can begin with the emperors themselves, and with the world they inherited, altered, and left behind. The office of Roman emperor did not begin with a single clear proclamation that everyone instantly understood. It emerged gradually from the long collapse of the old republic, after years of civil war, shifting loyalties and institutions that had been strained almost beyond repair. In the late republic, ambitious men had already begun to collect extraordinary powers for themselves, sometimes under emergency titles, sometimes through military command, and sometimes by presenting themselves as the only person capable of restoring order. By the time Augustus rose to dominance, the old political language was still being used, but it no longer matched the reality beneath it. Augustus was careful not to call himself a king, because Rome had inherited a deep distrust of kingship from its earliest stories and political memory. Instead, he gathered together powers that had once belonged to different magistrates, and he arranged them so that his authority seemed less like a seizure than a repair. That choice of presentation mattered enormously. The emperor came to be seen in theory as the first citizen, a man standing at the front of the Roman order, even while holding extraordinary command over armies, provinces, law, and public life. The office was both new and old at the same time, which helped make it possible. Augustus himself understood the value of appearance with a kind of disciplined intelligence. He cultivated modest clothing, avoided the theatrical excesses that might have reminded Romans of Eastern kings, and encouraged the sense that peace had returned after a dangerous age. He knew that power could be made more acceptable when it looked restrained. In statues and coins, he was often shown with calm features, a composed posture, and an expression that suggested endurance rather than swagger. The public image of the first emperor was not accidental decoration. It was part of the government itself. Temples, altars, inscriptions, and official portraits all helped teach Rome how to imagine authority in a new form. The early emperors were not merely rulers issuing commands from above. They were managers of atmosphere, shaping the feeling of stability, continuity, and restored order. The empire was governed from the center, but it was also narrated from the center, and that narration reached far beyond the city of Rome. Another early pattern was the importance of succession, even when succession was never fully secure. Rome had no perfect constitutional system for passing imperial authority from one ruler to the next. The transition could depend on family ties, adoption, military support, the favor of the Senate, or the willingness of key elites to accept the new arrangement. Often several of these factors had to align at once. This made every succession feel slightly fragile, as though history might take another path if one message arrived too late or one army chose differently. A ruler's household could become a political institution in its own right. Wives, sons, adopted heirs, stewards, tutors, freedmen, and trusted companions could all matter in ways that were difficult to predict from outside the palace. Decisions made in private rooms might echo across distant provinces. Because of this, imperial politics became deeply personal. The emperor was never only a public symbol. He was also the visible head of a delicate arrangement built on trust, fear, ritual, and the constant hope that one reign might continue smoothly into the next. Roman emperors are often remembered for vast architecture, but many of their most consequential acts were administrative and quiet. They appointed governors, supervised taxation, reviewed appeals, answered petitions, and managed the complicated relationship between Rome and its provinces. Their power moved through paperwork, decrees, and delegated authority as much as through ceremony. A farmer in North Africa, a merchant in Syria, or a veteran in Britannia might never meet the emperor in person, yet the emperor's name could still reach them through official seals, military diplomas, legal decisions, and inscriptions on public buildings. Roads extended imperial influence physically, but documents extended it socially and legally. Even towns far from Rome could feel the presence of the ruling house in an altar raised for imperial welfare, in a bronze tablet naming the emperor's authority, or in the expectation that local officials would act under the shadow of his oversight. The empire was not only a map of conquered land, it was also a system of repeated recognition in which distant communities learned to acknowledge the emperor as the source of order. The emperor's image was everywhere, but his body was limited. He could only be in one place at a time, and this limitation created a whole system of representation that became central to Roman rule. Portraits were copied across the empire so that the same imperial face could appear in marble, bronze, painted plaster, gemstones, or on the small surfaces of coins carried in everyday trade. These images were not always exact likenesses in the modern sense. They were often idealized, adjusted, and carefully selected to convey a message. Youthfulness might suggest vigor and legitimacy. A stern gaze might imply discipline. A calm, almost timeless expression could make the ruler seem greater than ordinary human change. In some cases, the portrait was more important than resemblance. It told people not simply who the emperor was, but what kind of presence he was meant to embody. The emperor was thus both a living man and a crafted symbol, a real person whose face had to be translated into a language of rule that could travel across stone and metal. One of the most enduring imperial symbols was the laurel crown. Laurel had long associations in Greek and Roman tradition with victory, honor, and the god Apollo, whose light and clarity were linked in Roman imagination to order and success. A commander returning in triumph might be crowned with laurel, and emperors made careful use of that inherited meaning. When laurel appeared on statues, coins, or ceremonial occasions, it suggested that the ruler stood within a tradition of conquest and divine favor. Yet Roman imperial symbolism was never limited to one sign. Eagles represented the legions and the reach of Roman military power. Fasces recalled magistrates and lawful coercion. Scepters, wreaths, thunderbolts, and divine emblems all appeared in different settings, each carrying a shade of meaning. Public power in Rome was communicated through a language of signs as much as through force. For someone living under the empire, these symbols might be seen so often that they became part of the background of daily life, as familiar as the shape of a road or the sound of a civic announcement in the forum. The imperial court itself was an environment of constant observation. Around the emperor moved servants, freedmen, guards, advisors, secretaries, dependents, relatives, and visitors, all occupying overlapping spaces near the center of authority. The court was not simply a palace in the modern sense. It was a living network of access, patronage, and caution. To be near the emperor could mean influence, but it could also mean exposure. A careful remark in one room might shape policy. A rumor in a corridor might become a formal accusation. A facial expression, if noticed by the wrong person, could be taken as support or disfavor. Because imperial power was so concentrated, emotional weather mattered. Many emperors learned that the greatest dangers were not always on the frontier, where enemies wore armor and formed lines of battle. Some of the most serious threats came from within spaces of comfort, in rooms filled with polite speech, lowered voices, and the silences that followed an uncertain question. In such an atmosphere, loyalty could be difficult to measure, and suspicion could grow quietly, almost like a shadow lengthening at dusk. The Praetorian Guard became one of the most famous forces in imperial Rome, and for good reason. Originally organized as an elite bodyguard for the emperor, it eventually acquired enough influence to help make and unmake rulers. Its existence reveals something essential about the nature of imperial politics. The emperor was expected to embody security, yet his own security depended on armed men stationed close to his person. That contradiction was never fully resolved. The guard was both protection and pressure, a shield that could also become a lever. Guardsmen knew they stood near the center of power, and that closeness could turn into bargaining power during crises. Their role reminds us that Roman emperorship was never simply a matter of law or title. It was a lived relationship between a ruler and the people positioned nearest to him. In many reigns, those nearest figures mattered as much as generals in the field or senators in the curia. Power in Rome was rarely simple, and it was almost never fully private. From the beginning, emperors had to balance military leadership with civil authority, and different rulers leaned in different directions. Some were strong commanders who spent much of their reign near the frontier, visiting camps, inspecting fortifications, and presenting themselves before soldiers as fellow Romans under arms. Others preferred the world of administration, law, and court politics, ruling more through letters and intermediaries than through direct presence in the field. The most famous emperors often left traces in both worlds. Their reigns can be read through battlefield victories and border settlements, but also through roads, aqueducts, temples, tax reforms, and surviving correspondence. A single emperor might be remembered for one grand conquest, while another might leave a quieter legacy of stabilizing institutions or improving the machinery of government. To study Roman emperors is therefore to study not just one kind of ruler, but a whole way of organizing the ancient world. Their authority touched soldiers, farmers, merchants, urban crowds, provincial elites, and the religious life of cities. They were commanders, judges, patrons, and symbols, sometimes all at once. Even in the earliest imperial age, people argued over what an emperor should be. Should he be austere or generous, distant or approachable, traditional or innovative, warrior or peacemaker? Should he preserve the old customs of Rome, or should he adapt them to the demands of a far larger and more complicated empire? These questions never fully disappeared. Different communities wanted different qualities from a ruler, and different writers praised different virtues depending on the times in which they lived. A successful emperor might be celebrated for mercy in one context and criticized for softness in another. He might be admired for decisiveness, then condemned for harshness. The same habit could look like steadiness to one observer and stubbornness to another. Each reign became a new answer to an old question, sometimes admired, sometimes regretted, and sometimes remembered only through fragments, inscriptions, and later stories. The history of Roman emperors is partly the history of a political role that no one ever quite managed to define completely, even as millions of lives were shaped by it. Augustus ruled for so long that his reign became a kind of template for later emperors. He lived into old age, which mattered deeply in a world where sudden death, illness, and violence could unravel a political order in an instant. In the Roman imagination, longevity itself could feel like proof of favor from the gods, or at least proof of careful management. Augustus had survived civil war, outlasted rivals, and slowly turned emergency rule into something that looked permanent. By the time he died, many Romans had spent their entire adult lives under his authority, and a younger generation had grown up knowing the emperor as a fixed presence in public life. That change happened gradually, which is part of why it endured. People often adapt more easily to a new system when it arrives by steps rather than by shock. Under Augustus, the imperial center became normal, and what had once seemed exceptional began to feel ordinary. Augustus also paid close attention to moral language, which gave his rule a softer edge in public memory. He promoted family values, public discipline, and religious renewal, presenting himself not simply as a ruler, but as a restorer of ancient customs. Some of these measures were practical and some were symbolic, and in Rome the two often overlapped. Laws about marriage, inheritance, and public behavior could signal a broader effort to stabilize society after decades of conflict. The emperor was not only governing bodies and revenues, he was also shaping ideals. Temples were repaired, rites were emphasized, and old forms were displayed with new seriousness. Moral legislation could not truly eliminate private behavior, of course, but it helped create a public image of order. In imperial Rome, a decree was never only a command. It was also a reminder of what kind of society the emperor wanted Romans to imagine when they looked at themselves. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, is often remembered as withdrawn and suspicious, though that image is partly the work of later storytelling. His reign also shows how difficult it could be to live under constant expectation. An emperor who did not perform warmth might be judged cold, while an emperor who seemed too visible could appear artificial. Tiberius was skilled in some ways and deeply reserved in others, and that reserve made him harder to read for contemporaries and for later historians. He spent significant time away from Rome, especially in the later years of his reign, and that distance gave his public image a shadowed quality. The island of Capri, where his court later became associated with isolation and rumor, entered the historical imagination almost like a stage set for anxiety. Ancient writers often turned Tiberius into a figure of caution, a ruler behind veils and silences. Modern scholars still try to separate propaganda, senatorial resentment, and genuine policy from the more dramatic legends that gathered around him. Caligula's short reign became famous for its dramatic stories, many of which are difficult to verify in detail. He is remembered as erratic and extravagant, but his image also reveals how Roman historians enjoyed moral contrast. When a reign turned unstable, later accounts often emphasized excess, danger, and spectacle, as if the chaos of power could be captured through vivid scenes. That does not mean nothing unusual happened. Caligula did cultivate a style that shocked elite observers, and his court could appear unsettling to those who expected restraint. Yet the surviving narrative is filtered through hostile voices, and that matters. Ancient biography and history often preserved not only events, but elite irritation, rumor, and retrospective judgment. Emperor stories in Rome are therefore stories about authority, but they are also stories about who gets to describe authority afterward. A brief reign can leave behind a very large shadow when later writers decide that it must stand for disorder itself. Claudius offers a different kind of imperial image, quieter and more administrative. He was not initially expected to rule, and that unexpected rise may have shaped the character of his government. Ancient sources often linger on his physical awkwardness and scholarly habits, describing him as if he were an unlikely ruler who had somehow slipped into power. But those same traits may have suited him to the tasks of administration. Claudius expanded imperial bureaucracy, improved the legal apparatus, and paid attention to practical governance. He oversaw important building projects and supported the conquest of Britain, which became one of the most famous outward expressions of his reign. His court also saw the growing importance of freedmen and professional administrators, a sign that the empire was becoming more complex and more bureaucratic. Claudius reminds us that emperors were not all soldiers, dramatists, or charismatic dynasts. Some were persistent managers whose influence appeared in paperwork, law, and systems that outlasted the noise surrounding them. Nero's reign has long been surrounded by fire, music, cruelty, and theatricality in the historical imagination. Yet Nero was also a ruler who invested heavily in public display and urban image. After the Great Fire of Rome, Rebuilding became central to the city's visual story, and the crisis itself became inseparable from the ways the emperor was remembered. The famous Golden House, or Domus Aurea, is often treated as a pure symbol of excess, but it also reflected a broader imperial ambition to reshape space, movement, and perspective. In a city of crowded streets, temples, porticos, and forums, architecture could speak almost as loudly as proclamations. Nero understood performance, and that made him unusual and unsettling to many aristocratic observers. Music, stage presence, and spectacle blurred the line between rule and entertainment. His legacy shows how rulers can become inseparable from the buildings, rumors, and emotions attached to their names. Even when later generations condemn them, they often do so through scenes that feel almost cinematic, as if memory itself had been staged. The year 69 CE, often called the Year of the Four Emperors, reveals how unstable succession could become when dynastic certainty vanished. In a single turbulent period, multiple claimants rose and fell, each tied to military support, political opportunity, and the shifting loyalties of armies. The speed of these changes made the empire feel fragile, yet it also showed the resilience of its institutions. Administration continued, taxation continued, soldiers still marched, and provinces still needed to be governed even as the throne changed hands again and again. That is one of the most striking things about Roman imperial government. An emperor could be replaced, but the imperial system itself often remained. The struggle of 69 CE became a kind of lesson, written in blood and uncertainty, about the role of armies in choosing rulers. It also reminded Romans that power was not always a smooth inheritance. Sometimes it was a contest of momentum, timing, and force, with history moving rapidly from one phase to another. Vespasian brought a more practical tone after the chaos. He is remembered for restoring order, strengthening finances, and beginning the Flavian dynasty. His rise from a military background to emperor demonstrates that Roman power could be surprisingly flexible when circumstances demanded it. He was not born to mythic splendor, and that may have made him useful in a period that needed steadiness more than glamour. Vespasian's reputation for plain speech and unpretentious habits helped distinguish him from some of the more theatrical rulers remembered in Roman history. He favored stability, revenue, and clear administrative priorities, and he understood that recovery after civil conflict required patience. Public projects such as the Colosseum later came to symbolize Flavian renewal, turning imperial rebuilding into something visible and enduring. The emperors who followed Vespasian were often judged by their ability to repair, organize, and continue. In that sense, his reign helped restore not only the government, but the feeling that Rome could still be managed by practical hands. Titus, though his reign was brief, became associated with generosity and relief after disaster. He dealt with the eruption of Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum, events that have made his era unforgettable. Such disasters were experienced locally first, in ash, darkness, and urgent flight, but they later entered Roman memory through official response and literary retelling. Titus was remembered as responsive and sympathetic, a ruler who appeared to meet catastrophe with composure. A short reign can still leave a deep impression if it coincides with moments that feel larger than politics. In Roman memory, emperors were often linked forever with the defining events of their time, even when those events were not of their choosing. Titus also benefited from the fact that his public image was framed after his death by contrast. He came to seem like a kindly figure, especially beside harsher successors. Memory in imperial Rome often works like that, with one reign illuminated by the shadow cast by another. Domitian, the last Flavian, was a capable administrator, but left a more controversial legacy. Ancient sources often describe him as severe and autocratic, especially in contrast with the idealized picture later writers preferred to preserve. He paid attention to military discipline, public order, and the dignity of his office, and those qualities may have made him appear increasingly authoritarian to elite observers. His reign reminds us that reputation in imperial history is partly political afterlife. The same actions can be remembered as firmness or tyranny depending on who tells the story and under what later circumstances. When senatorial writers disliked a ruler, they often emphasized fear, suspicion, and cruelty. When they approved, they might speak instead of justice and restraint. Domitian's memory was especially vulnerable to this process because later emperors had incentives to distance themselves from him and to present their own rule as a restoration after his death. Roman emperors lived not only in their own time, but in the judgments of centuries, where each account could quietly reshape the last. One of the most important features of Roman imperial rule was the ability to travel. An emperor who moved through the empire could do more than send orders from a distant capital. He could appear before soldiers, greet civic leaders, inspect roads and harbors, and let people see the living center of power with their own eyes. In a world where messages moved slowly and provinces could feel far away, the imperial journey itself became a kind of language. A royal visit announced that Rome was present. It also reminded everyone that the emperor was not simply a name on coins or a figure in legal documents, but a man whose arrival could alter the rhythm of an entire town. Such journeys were never casual. They required escorts, wagons, servants, animals, food supplies, local preparations, and a chain of officials who could keep everything moving. Roads had to be repaired or cleared. Towns prepared receptions. Temples might be decorated. A governor could spend days making sure the right gifts were ready and the right words were spoken. Even a small delay could matter because the emperor's passage created a ripple of expectation. When he entered a city, markets often quieted, and people gathered at the edges of streets to look on. The local elite came forward with petitions, honors, and ceremonial welcomes. In this way, imperial movement stitched the empire together, not only administratively but emotionally, by turning distance into encounter. Hadrian became one of the great traveling emperors. Unlike rulers who stayed long in Rome and relied more heavily on dispatches, he spent much of his reign moving from province to province, inspecting frontier lines, visiting cities, and observing the machinery of empire firsthand. Ancient sources and later historians often describe him as curious and energetic, someone who wanted to see the world he ruled. His journeys took him across a vast range of landscapes, from the cool edges of Britain to the sunlit cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. Each stop was practical, but also symbolic. By appearing in person, he strengthened imperial presence and reminded subjects that the emperor was attentive, mobile, and watchful. Hadrian's name is often linked to architecture, administration, and restraint. He was not known primarily as a conqueror in the older Roman style. Instead, he seemed to favor consolidation over expansion, which gave his reign a different texture from those of more aggressive rulers. Hadrian's Wall in Britain remains one of the clearest material signs of this policy. It was not simply a barrier. It was a line of organization, a statement that imperial power had edges and that those edges could be measured, guarded, and maintained. Such works carried both military and psychological weight. They told soldiers where they stood, and they told nearby communities that Rome had chosen to remain. Hadrian's relationship with Greece was especially notable. He admired Greek literature, philosophy, art, and public life, and he embraced them in ways that were unusual even for an emperor of his educated class. This did not make him less Roman. In a sense, it showed how Roman identity could expand without dissolving. The empire included older civilizations with deep traditions, and emperors often positioned themselves as heirs to those traditions as much as rulers over them. By supporting Greek culture, Hadrian presented Roman power as something capable of preserving and refining what it found worthy. Temples, games, libraries, and festivals all served this broader purpose. They were acts of patronage, certainly, but also of message-making. They said that civilization lived under imperial protection. The Greek East responded to this attitude in complex ways. Some communities welcomed it warmly because imperial favor could bring funding, prestige, and public works. Honorific inscriptions and statues often recorded these relationships in formal language, though the emotional realities behind them may have been more mixed. A city might praise an emperor in public while privately enduring tax burdens or administrative demands. Still, the cultural partnership between Hadrian and Greek urban life became one of the most recognizable features of his reign. It gave later generations a picture of an emperor who traveled not only to command, but also to observe, study, and belong, at least for a time, to the places he visited. Antoninus Pius is remembered as one of the calmer emperors, and his reign became a model of stability in later historical memory. Ancient writers often like to contrast peaceful rulers with more dramatic ones, and that contrast tells us a great deal about Roman expectations. The empire admired military success, yet it also depended on continuity. Taxes had to be collected, courts had to function, grain shipments had to arrive, provincial governors had to know where authority rested. A quiet reign could therefore be a major achievement, even if it produced fewer grand stories. In the background, life moved forward with less disruption, and that was felt as a kind of blessing. Antoninus' reign has sometimes been described as almost uneventful, but uneventfulness can be deceptive. A stable empire still contained ordinary pressures, local disputes, family inheritances, border concerns, and the slow churn of administration. What changed was the atmosphere. Under a steady emperor, there was less fear that policy would lurch suddenly, or that a purge or war might break the pattern of life. Roads remained open. Contracts could be signed with more confidence. Farmers, merchants, and city councils could make plans with a little less anxiety. For those living inside the system, such predictability mattered deeply. Great empires often seem smooth only because their strain is spread across millions of private lives. Marcus Aurelius stands out because he combined imperial duty with philosophical reflection. His meditations, written in Greek, do not read like polished literature in the usual sense. They feel closer to private notes, reminders to himself, fragments of moral discipline written in a voice that is serious but often gentle. That intimacy has made the work endure. It allows modern readers to glimpse a ruler not as a statue, but as a person trying to steady his mind while carrying heavy responsibility. He wrote about patience, transience, duty, and the need to accept what cannot be changed. The text is calm, but its calmness was achieved in the midst of pressure. Marcus is often called a philosopher emperor, though that title can make him seem distant or abstract. In reality, his reign was shaped by very concrete troubles. War required attention. Plague spread through the empire. Frontier defenses demanded resources. He had to think about discipline, logistics, and the fragile trust that held imperial administration together. His reflections do not remove him from these challenges. They show how closely he lived with them. He returned again and again to the idea that the self must remain upright even when the world is unsettled. That combination of inner discipline and outward burden is part of why he continues to fascinate readers. His writing also has a distinctly human texture. He reminds himself not to be angry too quickly, not to be impressed by vanity, not to imagine that fame will last. These are not the words of a ruler above the world, but of someone trying to remain decent inside it. The appeal of Marcus Aurelius lies partly in this tension. He was emperor, yet he wrote as though all power were temporary. He was surrounded by the apparatus of rule, yet his thoughts often drift toward the brevity of life, the proper use of time, and the duty to be useful while one can. That makes his meditations feel quiet but not detached. Lucius Verus, who ruled alongside Marcus Aurelius, shows another side of imperial partnership. Shared rule was not uncommon in Rome, especially when succession needed reinforcement or when the burden of command was too large for one man alone. Varus' role in the East during the Parthian War demonstrates how imperial authority could be divided in practice, even when it remained unified in theory. One emperor might be the central figure in ideology, while another handled military command or regional crises. This arrangement could be flexible, and it could also be delicate, since prestige had to be balanced carefully between co-rulers. Lucius Verus is often remembered less vividly than Marcus Aurelius, partly because ancient sources favored moral contrast, and partly because philosophical reputation tends to outshine administrative partnership. Yet his position matters. He reminds us that Roman government was not always solitary in the modern sense of a single ruler making every major decision alone. The empire could accommodate layers of authority, overlapping responsibilities, and formal cooperation. In the Eastern campaigns, command structures involved generals, advisors, and logistics on a scale that no emperor could manage by personal effort alone. Even the most celebrated emperor depended on a larger human network. Verus helps make that visible. The Antonine Age is sometimes imagined as a golden period, and in many respects it was. There was confidence in Roman power, a flourishing of urban life, and an imperial style that could seem polished and secure. Temples were maintained, laws were administered, and educated elites across the empire participated in a common cultural language shaped by Greece and Rome together. For many observers, especially those looking back from later and more troubled times, this age appeared to represent Roman civilization at its height. The memory of such eras often grows brighter in retrospect, as if later hardship shines a soft lamp backward onto earlier stability. But even a golden age has its edges. The empire was never free from pressure. Epidemics moved along roads and sea routes. Military campaigns consumed money and lives. Governors could be corrupt or inefficient. Borderlands always needed watching. In some regions, prosperity sat beside inequality. In others, local tradition adapted uneasily to imperial control. The golden quality of the Antonine Age was real, but it was never complete. It rested on systems that had to be maintained constantly. The peace of a large empire is not silence. It is a kind of managed vibration, one that can continue for years while carrying many hidden strains. Commodus inherited the throne after Marcus Aurelius, and his reign is often treated as a turning point in Roman memory. Ancient writers portrayed him as self-indulgent, theatrical, and excessively attached to spectacle, especially in the arena. He appears in stories as someone who blurred the line between emperor and performer, seeking admiration in ways that seem to violate traditional expectations of dignity. Such accounts may be sharpened by hostility and hindsight, because emperors who fell out of favor were often turned into symbols of decline. Still, even allowing for exaggeration, Commodus' image reveals something important about imperial culture. Roman emperors were expected to embody Rome, and that meant their public behavior had immense symbolic power. Commodus seems to have taken this expectation and pushed it into unusually visible forms. He presented himself in ways that were meant to dominate the public imagination, using ceremony, display, and personal image as tools of rule. This reminds us that power can become performance when the ruler controls the stage too completely. In a city like Rome, where crowd response mattered and reputation could be made through spectacle, the boundary between political authority and entertainment could become surprisingly thin. That boundary was always there, but under Commodus it seemed to wobble. Imperial children were also part of this system, even when they were far too young to understand it. Sons and daughters of emperors were not private children in the modern sense. They could be displayed in public, named in formal announcements, and represented in portraits or on official coinage. Their bodies carried the promise of continuity. A child in a palace might become a future emperor, a dynastic link, or a symbol of stability. Because succession was so important and so often uncertain, The family of the emperor became one of the most watched institutions in Rome. This gave imperial childhood a strange political quality. A young prince or princess could stand in for the future before the future had arrived. Their birthdays, titles, and appearances could all be read as signs. Even silence around them could matter. Court officials, senators, and provincial observers paid close attention to who was favored, who was healthy, and who was being prepared for public life. The emperor's family was not simply a household, it was part of the structure of the state. In that sense, Roman political culture extended into the nursery, where private life and public destiny were never fully separate. Roman emperors were often associated with divine favor, but not all of them were officially divine while alive. Apotheosis, the practice of declaring a deceased emperor divine, gave the imperial house a sacred dimension that was both political and religious. After an emperor died, rituals could be performed to honor his memory and elevate him among the gods. Coins, inscriptions, and ceremonies helped communicate this transition. The process was never merely symbolic. It helped legitimize the next ruler by suggesting continuity between mortal reign and eternal order. It also provided a formal language for mourning, one that turned loss into structure. The idea of apotheosis reflected a deeper Roman habit of linking power with sacred meaning. An emperor could be a man with flaws, illnesses, and mistakes, and yet his office might still be wrapped in divine associations. This tension mattered. It allowed the empire to present succession as more than a political accident. It became part of a larger cosmic story, one in which the ruler's life could end, but his public significance continued. In that sense, Roman imperial culture kept its dead emperors close. They remained present in statues, in memory, in prayer, and in the carefully managed imagination of the state. The Severan dynasty opened with Septimius Severus, a ruler whose path to power made clear how much the Roman Empire now depended on the army. He was not simply chosen in a peaceful or orderly way. His rise emerged from a world of competing generals, anxious provinces, and soldiers whose loyalty had become one of the most valuable forces in imperial politics. In earlier centuries, Senate approval and hereditary succession mattered greatly. Under Severus, military backing became just as important, and in some moments even more so. He strengthened the position of soldiers, gave greater prominence to the armed forces, and helped shape an empire in which emperors could not afford to ignore the men in armor standing behind their rule. That gave the state a kind of immediate strength, but it also created a long-term dependency. Once the army became central to legitimacy, future emperors had to keep earning that loyalty again and again, as though rule were a lamp that needed constant fuel. Severus also understood the symbolic value of family, and he promoted his household with care. In the Roman world, dynasties were not only about bloodline in a private sense, they were also public performances, presented through inscriptions, statues, ceremonial appearances, and carefully shaped official images. The emperor's wife, sons, and heirs were placed before the empire as signs of order and continuity. A family could serve as an argument for stability, yet the imperial family was never truly protected by its grandeur. The higher one stood, the more exposed one became to intrigue. Sons could be rivals, not just successors. Mothers could be political actors. Courtiers could shift from favor to danger in a single season. The Severan court, like many imperial households, was both a center of authority and a place of quiet tension, where affection and ambition often sat uncomfortably close together. Caracalla, the son of Septimius Severus, remains one of the most consequential emperors of the early 3rd century, especially because of the Constitutio Antoniniana. This famous decree granted Roman citizenship to many free inhabitants of the empire, a change that altered the legal shape of Roman life on a vast scale. Citizenship had long carried privilege, identity, and access to legal protections, and for centuries it had belonged primarily to a narrower portion of the population. Caracalla's decision widened that circle dramatically, though not always in ways that felt equal in daily life. Some historians think the measure may have had practical fiscal motives, since broader citizenship could bring new tax implications. Others emphasize political or ideological reasons, or perhaps a wish to bind the empire more closely to the center. Whatever the motive, the result was immense. It was a reminder that Rome did not only conquer with legions, it also ruled through law. A single imperial decree could expand the definition of belonging across thousands of miles, from busy ports to inland towns, from market squares to frontier settlements where the language of Rome mixed with local customs. Caracalla's reign also shows how violent succession could become in imperial politics. The family tree was never merely a family tree. It could become a battlefield. Ancient emperors knew that the household around them was saturated with risk. Brothers might become enemies. Mothers might be accused of plotting. Generals, servants, and advisors could all be pulled into dynastic struggles that ended in murder, exile, or civil war. In the Roman palace, there was no clear boundary between domestic life and state power. A dinner could carry political meaning. A private audience could decide the future of the empire. Even silence could be dangerous if the wrong person interpreted it as weakness or disfavor. For that reason, the imperial residence often seems in the sources less like a home than a shifting chamber of calculation, where everyone understood that tomorrow could bring a new order, or simply a body carried away in the dawn. Elagabalus stands out as one of the strangest and most debated figures in Roman imperial history, though that strangeness itself must be handled carefully. Much of what survives about him comes from hostile literary traditions, and those sources often wrote with moral outrage, political prejudice, or a taste for sensational detail. He came from the East, associated with the cult of the sun god Elagabal, and his reign became entangled in stories of religious novelty, court excess, and social disruption. Some of the claims made about him are likely exaggerated, while others reflect real tensions about identity, ritual, and power. Even so, the story of Elagabalus reveals something important about Roman expectations. The emperor was supposed to embody a recognizable Roman order. He should appear stable, disciplined, and appropriately traditional. When an emperor seemed to depart sharply from those expectations, observers did not merely see an eccentric ruler. They saw a disturbance in the very grammar of imperial authority. Religious innovation at the top of the state could feel unsettling because religion and politics in Rome were never far apart. Temples, priesthoods, festivals, and sacred symbols were all folded into the public life of power, and any change in that sphere could ripple far beyond the palace. Alexander Severus followed in a more restrained and measured spirit, and many ancient writers present him as a ruler who tried to restore calm after a more turbulent period. He is often described as valuing advice, order, and moderation, as if he hoped to govern through balance rather than force. That approach had its strengths, especially in an empire where the memory of instability was never far away. But he ruled during a time when pressure was increasing on many fronts. Borders required constant attention. Military commanders expected influence. Court politics remained delicate. Internal weakness made every external challenge feel heavier. In such conditions, even a conscientious emperor could find the ground shifting under his feet. Alexander Severus's death has often been treated as the symbolic close of a calmer age, though perhaps that calm had already been fragile for some time. His reign reminds us that good intentions alone could not easily hold together a system facing growing strain. The empire was still vast, still wealthy in places, still astonishing in reach, but its mechanisms were becoming harder to coordinate, like a great instrument slowly going out of tune. After Alexander Severus came the crisis of the 3rd century, a period that can feel almost dizzying in its speed and uncertainty. Emperors changed with alarming frequency. Some were elevated by their troops, some were overthrown by rivals, and some died in battle before they had time to establish a durable public image. One reason this era seems so unstable is that military acclaim became an even more direct path to the throne. A commander supported by his soldiers could be declared emperor far from Rome, then march, negotiate, or fight his way into the broader imperial contest. Frontier pressures increased. Usurpers appeared in different regions. Local command structures grew more important. The empire did not vanish, but its center of gravity seemed to shift and multiply. To people living through it, the years may have felt as if the imperial office itself had become a lantern passed quickly from hand to hand in a dark corridor, each new holder trying to keep the flame alive while the walls around them trembled. Yet even in crisis, emperors understood the need to project continuity. The coinage of the 3rd century remained one of the most important tools of imperial communication. A new emperor's portrait could be struck in metal and sent through the economy with remarkable speed. Coins traveled in pay packets, tax deliveries, and trade transactions. They passed through markets, taverns, granaries, and army camps. They were small, durable, and familiar, which made them ideal carriers of authority. For many people in the empire, the emperor was encountered most often not in a ceremony or audience, but in the palm of the hand as a face in bronze, silver, or gold. The emperor's profile, the titles around the edge, the religious symbols on the reverse, all of these helped announce that rule still existed, even when the political situation felt uncertain. In a sense, coinage was a quiet reassurance. It said that the system was still turning, that messages still moved, that the state had not stopped breathing. Gallienus, who ruled during this troubled century, is often treated as a lesser emperor by older narratives, perhaps because he governed in such a difficult age that visible triumph was hard to come by. Yet his reign deserves more patience than it sometimes receives. He faced invasion, internal fragmentation, and repeated revolt. In some regions, imperial authority broke apart into competing powers. In others, the army demanded urgent adaptation. Gallienus responded with military reforms and with a more flexible approach to imperial association than earlier rulers had tended to favor. Scholars sometimes see in his reign a sign of transition, not simply failure. He reminds us that survival itself can be a serious imperial achievement. Some emperors reign amid peace and leave behind great building programs or famous conquests. Others spend their energy preventing collapse. That work may produce fewer triumphal monuments, but it still shapes history. A ruler who keeps the state together during pressure is still ruling, even if later generations find the story less easy to celebrate. Over the course of the 3rd century, the imperial image became more severe and more direct. Portraits grew larger-eyed, more stylized, and less concerned with the serene realism favored in earlier periods. This change was not only artistic, it also reflected a changing political mood. When stability weakens, rulers often choose a more intense visual language. The face on a coin may seem to stare back, alert rather than relaxed, as if consciousness itself were part of the message. In earlier imperial art, the emperor might appear composed, almost distant, with a calm that suggested order already achieved. In the later 3rd century, that calm often gave way to something sharper. The gaze could appear fixed and watchful. The features might be simplified, even hardened. Such portraits tell us that art in Rome was not merely decorative. It was part of governance. It helped communicate confidence, resolve, and endurance at moments when words alone might not be enough. And so, in this period of unstable rule, the emperor's image became a kind of weather vane for the state. When the world felt insecure, the portrait looked firmer. When the army's loyalty mattered more than ever, the face on the coin or statue needed to convey authority at a glance. It was as though the empire, uncertain of its own future, kept adjusting the expression of its ruler in search of reassurance. The sculpted brow, the hard eyes, the controlled jawline all became part of a visual language of endurance. Even in silence, those images spoke. They spoke of a government trying to remain whole, of a world where legitimacy had to be renewed repeatedly, and of a Roman Empire that, despite all its strain, still believed deeply in the power of faces, titles, and symbols to hold a vast and complicated order together. Aurelian is one of the emperors most closely associated with restoration. He reunited a fractured empire after territorial breakaway states had emerged in the west and east, and the scale of that achievement can be easy to underestimate when it is read quickly on a page. For a time, Roman authority had seemed to splinter under pressure, as if the long imperial structure were loosening at its seams. Aurelian's victories gathered those pieces back together. That is why later memory gave him the title Restorer of the World, a phrase that carries not only triumph, but also exhaustion, relief, and the sense that order had returned after a period of anxious uncertainty. He did not create a new empire so much as recover one that was in danger of slipping apart. In that sense, his reign belongs to the quieter kind of greatness, the sort that repairs what others assume will always remain intact. He also strengthened the city of Rome with new defensive walls. The Aurelian walls still mark a vast perimeter around the ancient city, and even in ruins they suggest how large and vulnerable Rome had become. The old image of the eternal city could conceal a practical truth. Rome was not invulnerable, and emperors had to think in terms of gates, earthworks, patrols, and thick stretches of masonry. The wall lines are a reminder that imperial history is not only a story of ceremonies and laurel crowns, it is also a story of carpenters, stonecutters, surveyors, and soldiers standing watch in dim hours before dawn. An emperor's work could be intensely practical. Wall building, troop movement, and administrative consolidation may seem less glamorous than triumphal arches, but they speak to the reality of rule. The emperor did not only symbolize greatness, he also responded to danger, and sometimes that response took the form of masonry rising against the sky. Diocletian reshaped imperial government even more dramatically. He created the tetrarchy, a system in which rule was shared among multiple emperors, with senior and junior rulers linked together in a carefully ordered hierarchy. This was not a casual arrangement, but an attempt to manage the scale of the empire more effectively. One ruler could not be everywhere at once. The frontiers were too long, the crises too frequent, and the demands of command too many for older habits of solitary rule to solve. Diocletian responded by distributing authority while preserving the idea of imperial unity. In some ways, the system was a mechanical answer to human limits. It acknowledged that empire had grown too large to be governed from a single center by one pair of hands alone. The tetrarchy also gave imperial life a more formal and ceremonial tone. Emperors became more distant, more grandly presented, and more consciously separate from ordinary subjects. The change was both administrative and psychological. Power began to feel less like a public office and more like a structured, elevated institution. Diocletian's reforms touched taxation, administration, and military organization. He sought clarity in an empire that had become too large and too pressured for older habits alone. Some of his measures were practical responses to immediate problems, while others reflected an almost architectural desire for order, as though the state itself needed to be redesigned with stronger beams and more clearly marked corridors. He tried to regularize the burdens that held the empire together, and the surviving traces of his reforms suggest a ruler deeply concerned with stability, measurement, and discipline. In the background of these changes was a world of anxious movement, soldiers along frontiers, officials calculating supplies, and local communities adjusting to a more tightly managed imperial system. His reign illustrates a recurring Roman truth. When the system grows more complex, the emperor often responds by making power more structured and more visible. Diocletian did not merely rule within the imperial machine, he tried to remake the machine itself. One of the great symbolic changes of this period was the use of more elaborate court ritual. The emperor could be approached only in controlled ways, with access carefully filtered through officials, attendants, and ceremonial expectations. Audience with the ruler became more formal, and this distance altered the experience of power. Earlier emperors had often cultivated a style that at least pretended to first citizenship among equals, even when the reality was never quite so simple. Later emperors increasingly resembled sacred monarchs, elevated by custom, fabric, posture, and language. The transformation was gradual, but it mattered. Roman history in these centuries was not just a sequence of battles and edicts, it was also a slow reimagining of how a ruler should be seen. The emperor's clothing, his gestures, the ordering of those who approached him, and the careful management of space all became part of the political message. Roman emperors were learning to rule an empire that no longer felt like a city-state expanded outward, but like a civilization held together by ceremony, distance, and the repeated performance of authority. Constantius Chlorus, one of the rulers in the late imperial system, helped shape the environment in which Constantine would rise. These transitional emperors may seem less famous than the great names that surround them, but they mattered enormously because they stabilized a world in motion. The late 3rd and early 4th centuries were full of shifting loyalties, regional pressures, and changing expectations, and not every important ruler left behind a dramatic legend. Some did the patient work of holding lines, balancing rival interests, and keeping imperial structures from collapsing while larger transformations were still underway. Constantius belonged to that category of indispensable but often understated figures. In late Roman history, some of the most important people are those who created conditions for later change. Their work is quieter but essential, like foundations that remain unseen while the building above them rises into view. Constantine is among the most significant emperors in all of Roman history. His victory at the Milvian Bridge and his patronage of Christianity altered the direction of the empire profoundly, and later generations would continue to debate how sudden or how complete those changes really were. Yet Constantine was also a political pragmatist, attentive to the practical shape of rule. He understood symbolism, urban planning, and military authority. The foundation of Constantinople was one of his most lasting acts, establishing a new center of gravity in the empire and signaling that the world of Rome was expanding its own internal geography. Cities were not merely backdrops to imperial life. They were instruments of power, places where memory could be concentrated, offices could be housed, and imperial identity could be displayed in stone, streets, and ceremonial spaces. A new capital was never only a city. It was a statement about where the future might reside. Constantine's conversion and support for Christianity transformed imperial identity, though not overnight and not in a simple straight line. Religious change in Rome often unfolded gradually, with old practices lingering beside new commitments, and even the most decisive imperial policies had to contend with habits deeply rooted in daily life. Temples did not disappear in a moment. Festivals did not vanish all at once. Families, soldiers, bishops, priests, and local communities all carried different expectations into the new age. The emperor's role in religion became more complicated as the empire's spiritual landscape shifted. He was no longer merely a patron of traditional rites, but increasingly a figure whose choices could affect doctrine, hierarchy, and public belonging. Roman history in this era is full of overlapping worlds: pagan temples, Christian basilicas, old ceremonies, and new theological debates. That layering gives the period its particular texture, a sense that one age was not erased by another, but slowly pressed into coexistence. Julian, later called the Apostate, tried to revive traditional pagan worship after Constantine's dynasty. His reign was brief but memorable because it represented an attempt to steer the empire in another religious direction, or at least to reopen possibilities that seemed, to others, already closing. Julian's story reminds us that Roman emperors were not only rulers of armies and tax systems, they were also participants in deep debates about divine order, tradition, philosophy, and civilization. He had the mind of a thinker as well as the authority of a ruler, and his policies carried the atmosphere of an intellectual project as much as a political one. Yet the empire he inherited had already changed. Old cults remained, but they now existed in a crowded and contested religious landscape. His effort to restore traditional worship can feel like a moment of last resistance, though that phrase may oversimplify what was likely a more complicated and nuanced program. Religion was inseparable from legitimacy. To choose one worship over another was also to choose a vision of what Rome was and what it might become. By the late empire, imperial portraits and titles grew even more formal. Emperors increasingly appeared as remote, splendid figures, surrounded by the language of majesty and framed by visual codes that made their power feel ceremonial rather than familiar. This was not simply vanity. It was one response to a political world that had become vast, sacred, and unstable all at once. An emperor could no longer rely only on the easy visibility of the old civic model. He had to seem larger than ordinary life because the empire itself had become a monument of scale, stretching across distances that demanded abstraction as much as direct presence. Titles accumulated, images were refined. The emperor's likeness became less personal in some ways and more symbolic in others. The result was a kind of deliberate remoteness, a carefully maintained grandeur meant to protect authority from the frictions of daily politics. Roman emperors in this late period were not just men in power. They were institutions rendered in human form, and the splendor around them was part of the work of holding the empire together. The later Roman Empire was an age of emperors whose names are often less familiar, yet whose influence was immense. By this stage, the empire had become so vast and so administratively intricate that no ruler could govern it with simple gestures alone. Frontier defenses had to be watched, court politics had to be managed, religious disputes had to be answered, and local elites had to be persuaded to remain loyal. An emperor might spend one season moving troops, another receiving envoys, and another weighing doctrinal arguments raised by bishops and advisors. It was a world in which the imperial office had grown more layered, almost like a room with many curtains drawn across it, each one revealing a different part of the state. The later emperors were not less important for being less celebrated. In some ways, they were more important because they ruled in an atmosphere where every decision seemed to touch several systems at once. Valentinian, I was one of the emperors who embodied the military seriousness of this period. He was known for his energy, his sternness, and his attention to the defense of the frontiers. Like several rulers of the later empire, he shared power with a brother, Valens, in an arrangement that reflected both practical necessity and political caution. The empire was too large for one court to handle comfortably, so divided rule became a workable answer, even if it never fully solved the underlying strain. Such arrangements had a certain elegance on paper. One emperor could focus on one region, another on a second, while the imperial family provided the appearance of unity. Yet the reality was more delicate. If one court was threatened, the effects did not stay neatly contained. Communication had to be constant, and trust had to be maintained through long distances and uncertain roads. Shared rule could strengthen the empire, but it also meant that the fate of one ruler could quickly affect the reputation and security of the other. In a sense, it was a practical compromise that revealed the size of the world it was trying to govern. Valens, who governed in the east, is remembered above all in connection with the disaster at Adrianople. That battle, fought in 378, became one of those moments that later historians return to again and again, because it seems to mark a turning point, even if the empire itself did not collapse all at once. The defeat was severe, and the loss of Roman forces was deeply shocking. It reminded imperial observers that Roman military success could no longer be taken for granted simply because it had long been expected. The Eastern Army, despite its traditions and discipline, was not invulnerable. In the long sweep of Roman history, Adrianople became a symbol of change, not the instant end of Roman power, but a vivid sign that the balance of the world had shifted. Late antiquity is full of these moments, where the old confidence of the classical age gives way to a more anxious and adaptive political culture. Emperors from this point onward had to govern with a sharper awareness that the frontier might break, that enemies might move faster than expected, and that the empire's old rhythms were no longer fully reliable. Theodosius I stands out as the last emperor to rule both the eastern and western halves of the empire for a period, and that alone gives his reign a special place in Roman memory. He is also remembered for making Christianity more firmly central to imperial life, not in a single dramatic gesture, but through a long process of support, enforcement, and definition. By his time, Christianity had moved from being a persecuted faith to becoming deeply woven into the empire's public identity. This changed the atmosphere of imperial rule. The emperor was no longer simply presiding over temples, magistracies, and old civic rites. He was increasingly expected to engage with councils, bishops, creeds, and the boundaries of acceptable belief. Theodosius's reign belongs to that transitional world where theology and politics cannot be easily separated. A doctrinal dispute might carry implications for loyalty, public order, and the legitimacy of authority itself. In that sense, his era feels like a hallway where the old Roman state and the Christian empire are passing each other, each still visible, neither completely gone. Theodosius also helps show how emperors could become symbols of unity, even when the practical forces of fragmentation were growing stronger. His authority over both halves of the empire gave people the sense, however brief, that the Roman world could still be held together under one guiding hand. After his death, that sense became harder to sustain. The Eastern and Western courts developed more distinct priorities, different styles of governance, and different pressures from their respective regions. The old ideal of a single imperial center did not vanish at once, but it became increasingly difficult to preserve in practice. And yet the title of emperor remained powerful in both halves. The image of Roman emperorship proved remarkably durable. Even when the political map shifted, the concept of a legitimate emperor, crowned with authority and surrounded by ceremony, continued to organize how people imagined the state. That endurance is one of the quieter wonders of Roman history. Institutions may divide, but symbols can travel much farther than armies. Arcadius and Honorius, the sons of Theodosius, came to rule in a world where the emperor's personal power was often mediated by ministers, generals, eunuchs, and court factions. They were emperors, certainly, but the actual steering of government frequently rested in the hands of others. This does not make their reigns meaningless or purely decorative. Rather, it shows how the office of emperor could change shape while remaining central. The emperor was still the legal and ceremonial focus of the empire. Laws were issued in his name. His image still mattered. His court still gathered the attention of provinces, petitioners, and ambitious officials. But in daily practice, the machinery of rule could pass through many hands before arriving at the imperial desk. The young emperor might sit at the center of a brilliant and controlled environment, while the real negotiations occurred just beyond his immediate gaze. This layered style of governance gives the late Roman court a hushed, almost theatrical quality, as if many conversations were taking place behind a curtain that never fully lifts. Honorius's Western reign is especially remembered because it coincided with dramatic pressures and one of the most famous shocks in Roman memory, the sack of Rome in 410. That event has often been treated as a symbolic wound, because Rome, the city that had long stood for Roman greatness itself, was now vulnerable to violence from outside its walls. And yet the reality was more complex than the later legend suggests. the city did not cease to exist. The empire did not end in that year, but the emotional effect was enormous. People tend to remember the sack not only as a military event, but as a moment when an older sense of security seemed to fade. Honorius, like many emperors, became attached in later memory to a crisis he did not fully control. History often turns rulers into shorthand for entire periods. A name can come to stand for disorder, endurance, decline, or reform, even though the actual administration behind it was complicated and crowded with other actors. In this sense, the emperor is both a person and a vessel for collective memory. In the East, conditions were often different, and the empire there proved more resilient. The Eastern court had its own tensions, of course, but Constantinople gave it a strong and enduring center. The city was not merely a capital in the administrative sense. It was a living expression of imperial continuity, designed to gather power, display authority, and preserve memory. A capital holds more than offices. It holds ceremonies, archives, roads, churches, and expectations. It teaches people how to imagine the state. Emperors who ruled from Constantinople inherited the atmosphere created under Constantine, where Christian ritual, urban splendor, and imperial hierarchy formed a single visual and political language. The city's walls, harbors, ceremonial spaces, and gathering places all helped reinforce the idea that Roman power had not vanished, but had taken on a new and more Eastern shape. In such a city, emperorship could appear both ancient and newly organized, rooted in Roman tradition while adapting to Christian time. Zeno and Anastasius are two Eastern emperors who helped preserve the imperial structure through difficult years. Their reigns were not always celebrated by dramatic conquest or romance, but they mattered deeply for continuity. Zeno's period was marked by instability and competing pressures, yet the survival of the Eastern court through such conditions was itself significant. Anastasius, especially, became known for administrative competence and financial stability. He is one of those rulers whose importance can be easy to overlook precisely because his achievements were careful rather than spectacular. Quiet fiscal work does not usually inspire grand poems or popular legends, but the upkeep of the state depends on such practical measures. Revenue had to be collected, accounts had to be balanced, and expenditures had to be controlled. Without such discipline, soldiers go unpaid, public systems weaken, and confidence in government erodes. An emperor who could maintain stability, even without producing a dramatic story, could leave behind a durable legacy. In the long run, steadiness can matter as much as brilliance. By this stage in Roman history, the emperor had become something more like a sacred sovereign than a republican magistrate. That transformation unfolded slowly, and it did not erase the older Roman habits at once. Law still mattered, military command still mattered, public giving still mattered, ceremonial display still mattered. The emperor could appear in a procession, distribute favor, receive petitions, and project the majesty of the state through carefully controlled ritual. Yet the tone had changed. The ruler now occupied a world shaped by Christian ideas of authority, moral order, and divine favor. The old republican memory remained beneath the surface, but it was no longer the main language of power. What makes the imperial office so fascinating is this blending of layers: old and new, military and sacred, civic and ceremonial, Roman and Christian. It was never one thing only. Even in its later form, it carried traces of the past while pointing toward a different political future. When people imagine the Roman emperors, they often picture marble portraits and formal ceremonies, but the reality was much more intimate and often much more physical. An emperor's authority was not only announced in decrees and coins, but also through routine. He was expected to appear in public in the right garments, at the right hour, surrounded by the right symbols. Purple dye, for example, was not simply a color choice, but a slow, costly statement of imperial rank. its deep tone associated with wealth, distance, and power gathered from across the Mediterranean. Even the fabric itself could matter. A tunic, a cloak, a breastplate, or a ceremonial shoe could signal rank more clearly than a speech. Roman writers often paid close attention to these details because in imperial life appearance was never just appearance. It was policy made visible. And yet the emperor's daily life was not always grand. Much of it was administrative, repetitive, and quietly exhausting. Messages came from provinces in every direction, and each one might carry a complaint, a petition, a military report, or news of a fire, a flood, or a border disturbance. Some emperors worked with astonishing intensity, reading, dictating, and answering until late into the night. Others relied heavily on freedmen, secretaries, and trusted aides, turning the palace into a kind of humming bureaucratic machine. It is easy to imagine an emperor as a solitary figure, but in practice he was often surrounded by layers of attendants, specialists, guards, and messengers, each contributing to the fragile rhythm of rule. In this sense, imperial power was both solitary and crowded at once. The palace itself could feel less like a home than a controlled environment. Rooms were arranged to impress, but also to manage access. A visitor might pass through corridors, waiting chambers, courtyards, and guard posts before ever seeing the emperor, if he was seen at all. Marble floors could echo with footsteps, while curtains, bronze fittings, and shaded colonnades softened the brightness of the day. At Rome, on the Palatine Hill, imperial residence gradually expanded into something like a small city of power, built up by successive reigns. Some emperors preferred simple chambers and plain habits, at least in reputation, while others embraced extravagance with astonishing confidence. But even simplicity could be theatrical. In Roman politics, restraint was often as carefully staged as luxury. There is also something striking about how often Roman emperors were judged by their relationship to time. They were expected to move with speed during crisis, but also to cultivate patience, ceremony, and gravitas. The empire stretched so far that no emperor could truly be everywhere, and so every decision was shaped by delay. News arrived slowly from frontier forts or provincial capitals, traveling by horse, ship, and courier road. By the time a report reached the center, the situation might already have changed. This meant that imperial rule was always partly an act of interpretation. The emperor had to imagine distant landscapes he might never see, relying on words, maps, and trusted intermediaries. The greater the empire became, the more power depended on the ability to govern what was absent. Some emperors understood that power could be made to seem natural through familiarity. They appeared often in public, attended games, reviewed troops, and participated in religious rites, so that their authority would feel woven into daily life. A procession, a sacrifice, a distribution of grain, or a speech in the forum could all reinforce the idea that the emperor was at the center of Roman order. At the same time, public visibility was risky. Crowds were unpredictable. Applause could shift to murmuring, and murmuring to outrage, especially in a city where politics and entertainment blended so easily. The emperor's body itself became a public object, watched for signs of health, fatigue, anger, or weakness. Even a slight limp, a hesitating voice, or an awkward expression could become a topic of conversation. In Rome, the ruler's body was never only his own. It is worth pausing on the strange emotional distance that often existed between emperor and subject. The empire was built on personal loyalty, but most people never met the man whose image they saw on coins, statues, or documents. For many provincials, the emperor existed as a face in profile, a name in an inscription, a birthday in the civic calendar, or a distant guarantor of justice. This gave imperial rule a peculiar texture. It was intimate in symbolism and remote in experience. A farmer in Egypt, a merchant in Syria, or a veteran in Britain might each invoke the emperor, but in very different ways and with very different expectations. The emperor could be imagined as father, protector, judge, or tax collector, depending on the moment. That flexibility helped Rome endure for so long. Then there is the matter of succession, one of the most delicate and unsettling problems in Roman imperial history. Rome never developed a perfectly stable, automatic law for passing power from one emperor to the next. Sometimes a son inherited the throne, sometimes an adopted heir was chosen, sometimes the army, the Senate, or a coalition of elites recognized a new ruler after the death or removal of the old one. This uncertainty made the emperor's family into a political stage. Wives, children, brothers, and adopted heirs might be honored, displayed, married strategically, or quietly eliminated from view. Portraits of imperial families could communicate continuity, but they could also conceal fear. A dynasty was a promise that the future could be orderly. In reality, the future was often negotiated in suspense. The Roman emperor also lived under the shadow of religion, though not in the modern sense of a separation between sacred and political life. The princeps, as many emperors were first called, had obligations to the gods, the people, and the genius of Rome itself. Sacrifices were not simply personal devotions, but public acts that affirmed the favor of the divine world. Bad omens could delay military campaigns or public assemblies. Lightning, birds, dreams, and strange coincidences might all be interpreted as messages requiring response. Some emperors cultivated piety carefully, while others were accused of disrespect or impiety by hostile writers. Because ancient historians often judged rulers morally, religious behavior became part of a larger narrative about legitimacy. Even so, these accounts should be read with caution. What one writer describes as arrogance, another might have seen as confidence or innovation. The gods, too, were interpreted through politics. Closely tied to this was the emperor's relationship with the army, perhaps the most important audience of all when power was in doubt. Roman emperors depended on soldiers not only for conquest but for survival. A ruler could be acclaimed by troops, protected by them, deserted by them, or killed by them. This gave the military a steady, almost uncomfortable proximity to imperial authority. Camp life itself was practical and harsh, full of drills, fortifications, supply problems, and repeated marching. An emperor who visited the front might wear a soldier's cloak, inspect equipment, dine simply, and show himself as a commander who shared the burdens of the men beneath him. This image could be powerful, especially in times of war, but it was also fragile. Soldiers were highly observant, and they knew when a ruler was sincere and when he was performing the role too carefully. In the calm spaces between campaigns, emperors sometimes turned to architecture as a way of shaping memory. Buildings could outlast speeches, victories, and even dynasties. A forum, an amphitheater, a temple, a bath complex, or a triumphal arch could all carry the emperor's name into future generations. Stone seemed to promise permanence, even though every Roman knew how uncertain permanence really was. Fires, earthquakes, political reversals, and simple neglect could transform monuments quite quickly. Still, the urge to build remained central to imperial identity. An emperor might restore an ancient shrine to associate himself with Roman tradition, or raise a new palace to announce a fresh era. Walking through these spaces, a Roman citizen could feel the layered presence of many reigns at once, as though the city itself had become a record of ambition. Finally, there is a quieter fact often overlooked amid tales of conquests and conspiracies. Emperors were human beings shaped by habits, illnesses, fears, and fatigue. Some suffered from chronic pain. Some faced long periods of grief after the loss of children or partners. Some were buried beneath the pressure of expectation. Ancient sources, especially hostile ones, sometimes exaggerate quirks or vices, but even the exaggeration hints at something real. A ruler who appeared extravagant may also have been isolated. A ruler who seemed severe may have been tired, suspicious, or simply afraid of being overthrown. To read about Roman emperors is to meet figures enlarged by power, yet still constrained by the ordinary vulnerabilities of the body. They ate, slept, worried, delegated, and aged. And because their lives were so closely watched, the smallest gesture could become history, while the larger truths remained, as they often do, partly hidden in the shadows of the palace. The imperial court could be a place of extraordinary ceremony. Audience halls, guards, attendants, and carefully managed access all contributed to the sense that the emperor stood at the center of a sacred order. To enter that world was not simply to enter a building. It was to move into a sequence of pauses, permissions, and formal gestures, where even silence could have meaning. In late antiquity, this ceremonial atmosphere became more elaborate still. The emperor's clothing, body language, and surroundings all communicated rank before a single word was spoken. A robe of the right color, a diadem set upon the head, a throne raised above the floor, or a carefully timed entrance into a hall could do political work almost as effectively as an army. The visual language of rule was meant to be read immediately by senators, generals, clerks, ambassadors, and petitioners alike. In a large empire, where not everyone could know the ruler personally, ceremony helped create the feeling that the emperor was present everywhere at once, carried into each room by ritual rather than by travel. This kind of ceremony helped stabilize authority in a huge and diverse empire. People who never met the emperor in person could still experience imperial order through repetition. A title announced in the same way, a formal bow repeated in different provinces, a document sealed with familiar marks, a procession that followed established custom. These were ways of making power feel continuous. The Romans understood that distance could weaken command if it became merely abstract, so they gave distance a ceremonial shape. A provincial governor, a military commander, or even a local community could encounter the emperor through the same recognizable forms that appeared elsewhere. In that sense, ritual was not just decoration, it was a practical technology of rule. It helped create a shared political language from Britain to Syria, even as local traditions remained strong and the empire itself remained full of differences. The Roman imperial system also produced many usurpers, and their appearance is one sign of how widely the idea of emperorship had spread. If an army could proclaim a commander emperor, then the title itself had become powerful enough to attract ambition. That does not mean every usurper believed only in personal greed. Some seem to have acted in response to crisis, local fear, or the collapse of central control. A border under pressure, a civil war, a weak child emperor, or a distant court could all create the conditions in which a soldier or governor thought he might be the one to restore order. Some usurpers were only briefly successful, while others controlled large regions for years and even struck coins or issued laws as if they were already legitimate. Their existence shows that legitimacy in Rome was both legal and performative. It had to be accepted by soldiers, administrators, and often by the wider public as well. The emperor was not simply a person who won power, he was a person whom enough others agreed to recognize as emperor. The eastern and western halves of the empire each developed their own rhythm, but the title of emperor remained central to both. In the east, emperors could last longer and govern through more stable institutions. Cities were rich, administrative traditions were deep, and the court at Constantinople had access to impressive resources. In the west, political pressure often made reigns shorter and more precarious. Military frontiers were under strain, tax systems were less secure, and rival commanders could emerge quickly. Yet the ideal of Roman emperorship endured in both places, adapted to changing realities. Even when the Western court weakened and finally disappeared, the Eastern emperors continued to present themselves not as something new, but as the rightful continuation of Roman authority. The same imperial idea could survive in altered clothing, across different languages and Christian forms, still carrying the memory of earlier centuries. Justinian, though technically a Byzantine emperor, still stands in the Roman imperial tradition and is often treated as one of its great later rulers. His reign is famous for legal codification, major building projects, and attempts to reclaim lost territories. In a way, he represents both the persistence and the transformation of Rome. His law code sought to gather, organize, and clarify centuries of legal material, turning a complicated inheritance into something more orderly and usable. His military campaigns aimed to restore old lands in North Africa and Italy, though those efforts were costly and not always lasting. And in Constantinople, monumental building gave his rule a visible shape. The Hagia Sophia is one of the most lasting monuments of that era, showing how imperial patronage could unite faith, engineering, and majesty. Its great dome and luminous interior came to symbolize a world in which divine favor, state power, and architectural skill seemed to meet. Justinian's world was no longer the early empire of Augustus, but it carried forward Roman claims in new and ambitious forms, trying to hold history together through law, stone, and spectacle. Justinian's wife, Theodora, also shaped imperial politics significantly. Her intelligence, resilience, and influence on court life have drawn strong attention from historians. She appears in the sources as a woman of unusual force, though the sources themselves must be read carefully, since some were written by admirers and others by critics. Like many famous figures from the past, she is partly historical person and partly layered memory. Still, it is clear that she was not a passive presence beside the throne. She seems to have influenced policy, supported certain religious positions, and taken part in moments of political crisis. Together, Justinian and Theodora illustrate how imperial power could be shared within a ruling partnership. Their story belongs to the long Roman tradition in which the emperor's household functioned as a political center. Family members, advisors, servants, bishops, and officials could all orbit the throne, shaping decisions in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes hidden. The court was never only the emperor alone. It was a small world with its own loyalties, tensions, and quiet negotiations. The endurance of Roman emperorship after the Western Empire fell reveals something remarkable. The office was more than a government post. It was an idea about universal order, legitimacy, and civilization. That idea outlived many of the institutions that first carried it. Even when borders shifted and languages changed, the memory of imperial Rome remained. Later rulers borrowed its symbols, its titles, and its sense of grandeur. Medieval kings, Eastern emperors, and even later political systems looked back toward Rome as a source of prestige and continuity. Sometimes that memory was accurate, and sometimes it was selective or romanticized. But it endured because Roman emperorship had come to represent something larger than any one dynasty. It suggested permanence in a world where most power was temporary, and it offered a model of rule that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of a single lifetime. One of the most comforting things about studying emperors slowly is that the list of names becomes less important than the recurring human pattern beneath it. Ambition, fear, ceremony, reform, war, family, memory. Every emperor entered a world already in motion and tried to leave a shape behind. Some succeeded more than others, but all participated in the same vast and delicate experiment. They inherited armies, laws, public expectations, and old rivalries. They faced hunger, revolt, succession problems, and the pressure of history itself. Even the strongest ruler could not fully control what came after him. A son might fail. A successor might erase his memory. A monument might survive while a reputation vanished. In that way, the emperor's life was both grand and fragile. The crown gave power, but it also placed a person under intense scrutiny, judged by achievements, rumors, and the changing moods of the state. Coins, statues, laws, and chronicles are what remain, but behind them were voices, courtyards, processions, and private decisions. An emperor could declare policy, but he could not fully control posterity. A law might survive in a collection, but the daily negotiations behind it are mostly gone. A statue might still show the calm face of a ruler, but it cannot reveal the fatigue behind the pose, the anxiety before a military campaign, or the long hours spent with advisors. That is why history preserves some rulers as saints, others as tyrants, and many as half-remembered figures between. Ancient authors often judged emperors in moral terms, while later historians try to separate propaganda from reality, though complete certainty is rare. The ancient world is quiet now, but the echoes of its rulers are still layered into the record. If we listen carefully, we can still hear administrative habits, ceremonial expectations, and private hopes hidden in the formal language of empire. If you imagine Rome at night, you can picture the imperial city in fragments: torchlight on stone, a guard at a doorway, a messenger carrying a sealed order, a sculpted profile in the dark, the hush of a palace corridor after a public ceremony has ended. The city would not have been silent in a modern sense. There would have been footsteps, distant voices, the clink of armor, the movement of animals and carts, the settling of large buildings into darkness. Yet there is still something restful about thinking of the imperial capital after the day's noise had thinned. Roman emperors lived within that atmosphere of grandeur and uncertainty. Their power was immense but always temporary. They could seem almost untouchable in public, surrounded by guards and symbols, and yet they remained mortal, vulnerable to illness, betrayal, and time. That temporary nature is part of what makes the whole story so human. The empire wanted permanence, but the people who ruled it moved through years like everyone else, one measured season at a time. Some emperors are remembered for peace, others for war, and others for the way they were described by later writers. Memory can be harsher than rule, and often far less precise. A competent emperor who left few dramatic scandals may be overshadowed by a more sensational figure whose reputation grew through rumor, moralizing anecdotes, or political hostility. Roman history is full of these distortions because the surviving sources are not neutral windows onto the past. They are literary works, political judgments, moral lessons, and sometimes court propaganda all at once. A historian reading them has to proceed slowly, noticing not only what is stated, but what is implied by tone, omission, and repeated emphasis. A praise can conceal a warning. A criticism can preserve admiration in disguise. In this sense, every emperor arrives to us already framed by later voices, and the frame can shape the whole portrait. This is why modern understanding of emperors often requires patience. We have to listen for what is said directly, and also for what lies underneath the phrasing. Ancient authors were skilled at suggestion. When they praised moderation, they may have been criticizing excess in a nearby ruler. When they condemned extravagance, they may have been defending social hierarchy or senatorial dignity. When they described an emperor as lenient, severe, careful, or careless, those words carried political weight. Even silence can be meaningful. Some reigns survive in rich detail, while others appear only in fragments, inscriptions, coins, and passing references. That imbalance is not random. It is part of how imperial memory was made. Every emperor, therefore, stands in a landscape of interpretation, with facts, stories, and inherited judgments gathered around the throne like layers of dust. Even the titles of emperors carried meaning, and Romans paid close attention to them. Augustus, Caesar, Imperator, Pius, Germanicus, and many other honorifics signaled military success, adoption, divine favor, ancestral legitimacy, or moral uprightness. A name could be a miniature political program. It could announce that a ruler was the heir of a famous predecessor, or the victorious commander of a frontier war, or the dutiful son of the state. Some titles were inherited, some were adopted carefully, and some were earned through public action and then repeated until they became part of the ruler's identity. Roman emperors understood that language itself could help govern opinion. Titles were not decorative ornaments for marble inscriptions. They were designed to be heard in the forum, read on coins, spoken by soldiers, copied by clerks, and repeated by ordinary people until they felt natural. In that way, a title could slowly become reality. Imperial succession often relied on adoption, because it allowed talented or trusted heirs to be chosen beyond strict bloodline. This was one of the more practical features of Roman politics, though it was never simple. Nerva's adoption of Trajan is a famous example of the strategy. Nerva was an older emperor with limited military backing, while Trajan had prestige, energy, and the support of the army. By adopting him, Nerva linked legitimacy to capability and created a smoother transition than a contested birthright might have produced. Adoption could reduce some uncertainty, though it never eliminated rivalry. Heirs still had to be accepted by soldiers, elites, and public opinion, and sometimes they were accepted only because no one better could be chosen. Still, the practice gave the empire a way of blending family, merit, and political calculation. The choice of an heir was one of the emperor's most consequential acts, because it could determine whether the state moved into stability, suspicion, or civil conflict. Trajan became associated with expansion and excellent government. Later Romans often spoke of him as an ideal emperor, a ruler whose memory carried a kind of settled brightness. That reputation shows how power and memory combine. Trajan's wars in Dacia, and the wealth brought back from them, gave him the aura of conquest. His public works in Rome, including roads, baths, markets, and monumental building projects, helped create the sense that military victory could be transformed into civic prosperity. He appeared not merely as a conqueror, but as a provider. Emperors were often judged not only by what they conquered, but by what they built. Stone, brick, arches, and roads could outlast the speeches made about them. Even so, the idealized image of Trajan was partly a later construction. It reflects what Romans wanted an emperor to be: strong in war, restrained in politics, and generous in the city. In memory, he became a kind of standard by which others were measured, and few could quite reach that height. Hadrian, who came after Trajan, took a more contained approach. He consolidated rather than expanded, and this too was a form of wisdom. Empire is not always best measured by size. Sometimes the most sustainable rule is the one that recognizes limits, strengthens boundaries, and gives attention to administration rather than conquest. Hadrian's reign is often associated with travel, inspection, and the steady maintenance of imperial systems. He visited provinces, reviewed soldiers, and observed the empire as a living structure rather than a map waiting to be enlarged. This made him very different from a ruler who sought glory through continual frontier advance. Yet Hadrian's restraint was not weakness. It reflected a different understanding of imperial responsibility, one concerned with balance, security, and long-term stability. This tension between expansion and consolidation runs throughout Roman history, and emperors are often remembered according to which side of the tension they favored. Some left boundaries farther out, others left them more secure. Later emperors inherited not just territory but expectation. The Roman world had grown accustomed to imperial leadership, and that familiarity itself shaped political life. Subjects across the Mediterranean, Britain, North Africa, and the Near East knew that a ruler in Rome, and later a ruler in Constantinople, would influence taxation, law, military defense, court appointments, religious policy, and public ritual. This was true even for people who never saw the emperor's face. Imperial authority reached them through officials, decrees, statues, coins, and the performance of loyalty in public spaces. Such familiarity made the emperor's power feel ordinary, even when it remained extraordinary. People became used to the pattern of rule, the expectations of petitions and favors, the rhythm of festivals and announcements, the uncertainty of succession, and the distant presence of a supreme figure whose decisions might shape an entire region. Over time, empire became less a shocking invention than the background condition of daily life. The political culture of Rome also valued the idea of divine favor in practical ways. Victories were attributed to the gods, and victory itself was a sign that the world remained ordered. Festivals reinforced cosmic balance. Sacrifices, processions, and public dedications linked human authority to supernatural approval. Emperor worship in some regions helped unify loyalty, though its forms varied widely from place to place. In certain cities, honoring the emperor was part of civic identity. In others, it was a careful negotiation between local tradition and imperial expectation. Religion was never merely abstract. It was woven into law, status, and public performance. Roman emperors did not stand outside religion, observing it from a distance. They helped define it, sponsor it, and benefit from it. They could be presented as favored by the gods, guided by providence, or protected by ancestral divine ties. Such claims did not remove political tension, but they gave rule a sacred texture that could be comforting, persuasive, or intimidating. Another recurring theme is health and vulnerability. Plague, injury, fatigue, and aging affected emperors like everyone else, but their bodies were public in a way ordinary bodies were not. Marcus Aurelius faced epidemic and war, and the strain of rule in a troubled age. Claudius lived with physical weakness in a culture that valued bodily display and visible command. Old age could be a source of dignity or concern depending on circumstances. A frail emperor might appear wise and experienced, or he might seem exposed to manipulation by courtiers, family members, or ambitious generals. The emperor's body mattered politically because it symbolized the condition of the state. A visible illness could shape expectations about succession. A sudden decline could prompt rumor. A scar, a limp, a tremor, or an exhausted appearance might become part of the story people told about the reign itself. The court, with its physicians, attendants, and watchful officials, often functioned as a place where the private reality of a body was converted into public speculation. Marcus Aurelius, in particular, embodies the Roman fascination with the burden of leadership under pressure. He is often remembered as the philosopher emperor, a ruler associated with reflection, duty, and endurance. Yet his reign was also marked by external threats, internal strain, and the difficult task of governing during crisis. That combination matters. It reminds us that Roman emperors were not only symbolic figures. They lived with messages from distant frontiers, with reports of illness spreading through towns, with financial demands, with administrative disputes, and with the ordinary exhaustion of continuous command. A ruler could spend the morning receiving petitions and the afternoon worrying about armies, harvests, and succession. From the outside, this may appear grand. From the inside, it could feel repetitive, heavy, and unresolved. The philosophical image of Marcus Aurelius survives partly because it gives shape to that pressure, translating responsibility into a calm and dignified posture. Claudius offers another kind of reminder. He was often underestimated in the ancient tradition, partly because later writers emphasized awkwardness, vulnerability, and dependence on stronger personalities around him. Yet his reign also shows the complexity of imperial competence. An emperor could be physically unglamorous and still effective in administration, law, and expansion. Claudius was involved in the conquest of Britain, and he strengthened parts of the imperial bureaucracy. He remains a figure where judgment depends heavily on which sources are given the most weight. Some portray him as manipulated. Others show a serious ruler operating within constraints. This uncertainty is useful because it resists the temptation to turn Roman history into a series of simple characters. Emperors were often composite figures in life, and even more composite in memory. As the centuries passed, imperial Rome became less a city-bound monarchy and more a distributed system of courts, armies, and sacred offices. The center of gravity could move. A ruler might be physically far from the old city and still command its traditions. Military camps, provincial capitals, and administrative hubs all became places where imperial authority was made visible. Yet the old Roman fascination with personality endured. People still asked who the emperor was, how he behaved, whether he was just or harsh, generous or miserly, pious or suspicious. They read the age through the character of the ruler, because the office seemed to concentrate the whole world in one person. The emperor remained a mirror. In him, Romans tried to see the condition of their state, the mood of their gods, and the shape of their future. And because that mirror could reflect hope as well as fear, it stayed central to Roman imagination for a very long time. When we look across the long line of Roman emperors, one of the clearest patterns is that no single reign tells the whole story. The empire changed gradually, and the emperor changed with it. Early rulers managed the delicate transition from republic to monarchy in all but name, learning how to rule without openly calling themselves kings. Middle period emperors presided over expansion, confidence, and careful administration, when roads, aqueducts, armies, and courts all seemed to work together in a broad imperial rhythm. Later emperors faced fragmentation, transformation, and the rise of new religious and political realities, when the center of gravity shifted and old habits had to be rewritten. The office endured by adapting, which may be one reason it lasted so long. That adaptability is perhaps the most important fact of all. Roman emperorship was never fixed in one form. It absorbed new ceremonies, new languages, new capitals, and new expectations as the centuries passed. In one age, an emperor might be praised for preserving republican appearances. In another, he might be celebrated for radiance, grandeur, and sacred distance. The same title could belong to a soldier, a dynast, a reformer, a philosopher, or a figure whose main talent was survival. Some emperors were remembered fondly, others bitterly, and many were remembered in contradictory ways, but each one helped teach the empire what power looked like in that moment. In that sense, the emperors were not just individuals. They were also a living lesson in continuity and change. If you were to walk through a museum late at night and pass Roman imperial portraits in a quiet row, you might notice how similar and how different they are. A youthful Augustus with carefully arranged features, a watchful Hadrian with his beard and attentive gaze, a stern late antique ruler whose face has become abstracted into authority, a polished coin with a tiny profile barely larger than a fingertip. These objects are small, but they carry immense weight. They once moved through hands, markets, treasuries, and temple offerings. They crossed distances without speaking and still helped create the emperor's presence in provinces he never visited. Marble can seem silent, but it remembers the hopes of sculptors and the demands of power. Coins may be tiny, but they were among the most effective tools of imperial memory. The emperors also remind us that history is often preserved through fragments. We have inscriptions with missing letters, shattered statues, coins worn smooth by handling, and manuscripts copied long after the original voices were gone. Much of what we know comes from piecing together evidence that was never meant to survive in perfect order. A damaged line on a stone can confirm a title. A portrait style can suggest a date. A surviving letter may reveal how an emperor spoke to an army, a city, or a friend. From these fragments, a civilization reconstructs itself. The Roman emperors live in that reconstruction, not as distant legends, but as a sequence of human decisions repeated across centuries, often clearer in outline than in detail, and always a little uncertain around the edges. Their world was one of ceremony and exhaustion, marble and road dust, triumph and compromise. Some ruled with sharp ambition, some with patient restraint, and some with a self-awareness that feels unexpectedly modern. Yet all of them belonged to the same immense inheritance. They sat at the center of an empire that was always more than one city, more than one army, and more than one person. The emperor's authority reached from palace corridors to frontier forts, from court banquets to distant granaries, from the glittering forum to the quiet rooms where taxes were counted and judgments recorded. The office was personal but never merely personal. Each ruler entered a machine already in motion, and each one altered its rhythm in some way, sometimes by design and sometimes by accident. One of the quieter truths about the emperors is how often their image mattered as much as their deeds. A ruler could issue laws, command armies, and supervise building programs, but he also had to be seen as a certain kind of person. Youth could suggest vigor, a beard could suggest Greek learning, a helmeted portrait could suggest readiness, and a radiate crown on a coin could imply solar power or divine favor. Later emperors, especially in the more ceremonial atmosphere of the late empire, used costume, protocol, and distance to make rule feel stable and almost sacred. To modern eyes, these details may seem decorative, but in Roman political life they were deeply practical. Image helped organize loyalty. Image helped fill the space between the emperor and the many people who would never meet him. The early emperors lived with the shadow of the Republic, even when they were quietly replacing it. Augustus understood better than almost anyone that Romans disliked the appearance of kingship, so he shaped his authority in a careful, almost elusive way. He allowed old institutions to remain visible while concentrating power in his own hands. Later emperors inherited that balancing act, though they did not always perform it with the same finesse. Some kept the language of republican modesty. Others leaned into open monarchy, especially as the empire became more complex and the court more central. The office evolved from a hidden supremacy into a more openly elevated one, and the change was gradual enough that many citizens probably felt it more as atmosphere than as a single dramatic break. Middle imperial rule could seem remarkably confident. This was the age of cities with baths and forums, of long stretches of relative stability, of emperors who traveled widely to inspect provinces, negotiate with local elites, and appear in person at frontiers. Hadrian, for example, is remembered not only for administration, but for movement itself, for a reign marked by journeys and attention to the edges of empire. Such emperors were often seen as maintainers rather than conquerors, and that was not a small achievement. A vast empire can be held together by steadiness, by the repeated work of listening, repairing, appointing, and confirming. Not every ruler leaves behind a dramatic conquest. Some leave behind a stronger sense that the structure can continue. Other emperors were builders in the most literal sense. They raised walls, expanded palaces, restored temples, and left behind public works that still shape the archaeological record. Building was never just about stone. It announced competence, generosity, and endurance. A new bathhouse or road could make imperial presence feel tangible in an ordinary city. A temple restoration could imply favor from the gods and respect for tradition. Even a palace extension could communicate that the court expected to remain. In the Roman imagination, a ruler who built well had not only used wealth wisely, but had inscribed his name into the fabric of daily life. Such projects were also practical acts of memory, because stone outlives speeches and crowds. And yet Roman imperial history is also full of fragility. The same office that could unify a world could also sharpen its divisions. Succession was always dangerous because no system can fully hide the question of who comes next. Some emperors prepared heirs carefully, while others left uncertainty behind them. Adoption, bloodline, military support, court favoritism, and sheer happenstance all played roles at different times. The result was a political culture that could seem orderly from a distance and deeply precarious up close. A ruler might be secure one season and under threat the next. Armies could proclaim, cities could hesitate, and rumor could travel faster than official news. The emperor, who appeared so solid in portraits and titles, often lived within a field of tension. That tension appears everywhere in the sources. Ancient writers could be admiring, cynical, moralizing, or simply baffled. One emperor might be praised for restraint in one account and condemned in another for the very same behavior. Surviving biographies often reflect the interests and anxieties of their authors as much as the emperors themselves. Court propaganda told one story, senatorial memory another, and local traditions yet another. Folk tales grew around certain names, especially those whose reigns were marked by excess, tragedy, or public spectacle. In later centuries, emperors could become almost legendary figures, carried through Christian chronicle, medieval retelling, or popular memory in forms that no longer match the original records. To study them is to move gently between evidence and echo. Some emperors became symbols of philosophy and inward discipline. Marcus Aurelius stands in modern memory as the reflective ruler, though his life was also shaped by war, plague, and the hard reality of governing under pressure. His example reminds us that Roman emperors were not always theatrical figures. Some were educated in literature, ethics, and the language of duty. Some wrote to themselves in private, perhaps trying to remain composed amid public burden. There is something quietly moving in the idea that the most powerful man in the world might still need to rehearse self-control in his own thoughts. Even so, the philosopher emperor was still emperor, and philosophy did not remove the need for armies, grain supplies, legal decisions, or the long patience of administration. Other rulers were remembered for their intensity, their suspicion, or their appetite for control. Ancient sources often sharpen these traits into memorable portraits, but behind the stories there remains the larger truth that imperial power encouraged extremes. The emperor stood at the center of patronage, prestige, and fear. People around him competed for access, favor, and safety. Even when a ruler preferred calm, the court could become a place of rumor and quiet rivalry. Even when a ruler sought reform, the machinery of rule could bend his intentions into something harsher. The documents that survive often reveal this atmosphere only in glimpses. A petition answered, a conspiracy uncovered, a law issued, a name erased. History becomes legible here not as a single narrative, but as pressure felt from many directions at once. In the later empire, emperorship grew more ceremonial and more visibly Christian, though the transition was neither simple nor sudden. New capitals and shifting centers of power changed how the ruler was perceived. Imperial authority could move east or divide, or be expressed through new court rituals that emphasized holiness and distance. Old pagan forms did not vanish in a single moment, and new Christian forms did not appear fully formed. Instead, titles, images, and ceremonies overlapped for a long time. Emperors could sponsor churches and still draw on older ideas of majesty. They could appear as defenders of orthodoxy, yet also rely on habits inherited from a pagan imperial past. The office kept adapting, and the empire kept teaching itself how to recognize legitimacy in altered surroundings. By the end, the emperors of Rome belonged to a world that no longer looked like the world of Augustus, even if it still remembered him. Regional powers mattered more. Ceremonial splendor carried greater weight. Religious identity shaped rule in new ways. The old Mediterranean confidence had broken into something more layered, more guarded, and in some places more anxious. Yet the imperial office persisted, because institutions can survive when they become flexible enough to hold many meanings. One emperor might be a field commander, another a theological arbiter, another a remote sacred figure glimpsed mostly on coins and in official decrees. The continuity of the title created the illusion of a single line, even as the substance of rule changed almost beyond recognition. And so, as the story settles into quiet again, we can let the imperial ages fade into their own soft twilight. The banners are folded, the forums are still, the coins have cooled in the hand. Rome remains, as it often does in history, not as a single moment, but as a long, echoing sequence of rulers, reforms, memories, and surviving names. What endures is not only conquest or grandeur, but the careful accumulation of adjustments, each one made by a person who believed he was ruling in the present while inheriting everything from the past. The emperors pass in review, but the empire lingers behind them like a long shadow on stone. Thank you for keeping this gentle company for a while tonight. If you are drifting off, let the marble halls and distant roads recede slowly into darkness, and let the long history of Rome keep moving quietly without you.